Good evening. I would like to welcome you to the concluding plenary of the fourth for 2026 conference. My name is Angelique Eccles. I am a Navy veteran, William and Mary class of 2025, a master's candidate in the clinical mental health counseling program in the School of Education. And I am also the graduate assistant in the Office of Student Veteran Affairs. It is my honor to read the William and Mary Land Acknowledgement. William and Mary acknowledges the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands our campus is on today. The Cherenhaka, Nottoway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Potomac, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members, past and present. Thank you for your attention. Next, I will introduce Anne Marie Stock, the Presidential Liaison for Strategic Cultural
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Angelique. It's wonderful to welcome you here to the Glen Close Theater. Quite an extraordinary venue here in our new Phi Beta Kappa Hall. So this is the fourth conference in our 5-year series for 2026. And this year's program focuses on wartime transformations, building on the foundation of teaching and learning established by previous events addressing revolutionary legacies, contested freedoms, and Virginia's revolutionary histories and beyond. As William and Mary's Presidential Liaison for Strategic Cultural Partnerships, it's been a great privilege and joy to help conceive and build this initiative in collaboration with so many exceptional colleagues. Kudos to all of them and all of those who worked particularly hard organizing this year's installment. As we prepare to commemorate the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding next year in 2026, this conference series creates the opportunity for conversations among scholars, educators, and the public about our nation's founding and future. It's an exercise in partnership, bringing together the expertise of William and Mary, Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, and the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation to discover, disseminate, and discuss our nation's origin stories. And doing so united in the belief that knowledge is a public good. For 2026 models and encourages civic engagement, advancing William and Mary's commitment to practice and promote democratic ideals in the pursuit of a more perfect union. As a nation, we face crucial conversations about the rights and obligations of 21st century citizenship. The more we know about our nation's past, the better prepared we will be to effectively participate in these conversations. It's now my pleasure to introduce my friend and esteemed colleague, Kathy Kelly, Executive Director of the Omohundro Institute.
Thank you, Angelique, and thank you, Anne Marie. And thanks to all of you who came inside on a glorious fall Saturday for tonight's plenary. I'd like to thank very briefly the program committee who assembled this stunning program that we've seen over the last 2 days. They would like me to share with you that a call for papers for next year's program is now available. You can find it online in multiple venues and platforms, and nothing would make them and me happier than to see you all back here next year. So please do look out for that call and consider coming back for the final installment of For 2026. I'd be remiss if I neglected to thank the conference partners who really do form the bedrock of this series. The Office of Strategic Cultural Partnerships at William and Mary and Colonial Williamsburg. As Anne Marie noted, For 2026 launched 4 years ago, and the individual iterations of this conference seem to get stronger every year. But to my mind, what is most remarkable about the For 2026 franchise is the way that it stands as a whole. For 2026 is an exceptionally timely reminder of the good that can come from engaged, intentional, and creative institutional partnerships. And it's been an extraordinary honor to participate in that. If partnership is key to For 2026, it's also a key word in Rob Parkinson's career. And it's now my pleasure to be able to introduce him to you this evening. Robert G. Parkinson is Professor of History at Binghamton University. He previously taught at both Shepherd University and briefly was a visiting assistant professor right here at William and Mary. He took his PhD from the University of Virginia, his bachelor's and his master's from the University of Tennessee. So, where does partnership come in? Rob has worked his entire career to offer his expertise and energy to any number of initiatives aimed both at building audiences for American history and at helping those audiences understand the complexities and the ironies of the past. His editorials have appeared in Time Magazine, The Washington Post, and the New York Times, among many other outlets. He has contributed chapters to at least 8 edited volumes, and he's taken tirelessly to the conference circuit, to public libraries, to museums, and to college and high school classrooms across the country in order to share what he has learned about our nation's past. So what has he learned? Rob knows that life in vast early America was neither easy nor straightforward, and he insists on histories that say so. Those intellectual and civic commitments are evidenced in all 4 of his books, beginning with his prize-winning Common Cause, Creating Race and Nation in the American Revolution, published in 2016 by the Omohundro Institute. 13 Clocks, How Race United the Colonies and Made the Declaration of Independence, published in 2021 by the OI. Heart of American Darkness, published in 2024, and the forthcoming Tyrants and Rogues, Understanding the Declaration of Independence, which will be available next summer, 2026. His talk this evening comes from Heart of American Darkness, and it's a fitting meditation, and one that is particularly appropriate at a conference that has been aimed at exploring the experience of war in the age of revolutions. Please join me in welcoming Rob Parkinson. Thank you.
Okay, the Glenn Close Theater. All right. Before I get started, I should probably establish my bona fides. I'm going to be talking a lot about a part of the world that is both claimed by Pennsylvania and Virginia. Given that I am in Virginia, I should probably tell you that where a lot of this takes place is where my folks are from and where I grew up. In Western Pennsylvania, and this is some bearing to this, there were When George Washington and Alexander Hamilton decided to put down the Whiskey Rebellion, and they sent 13,000 militia to go find a rebellion and didn't find any, they had to arrest a few people, and one of those people was Benjamin Parkinson, which is my ancestor. And but he was pardoned by the President of the United States for reasons of insanity. So remember that for this talk. So remember, insanity runs in my family. And also, at least according to General Washington. And but I've spent a long time in Virginia, and I'm wearing a Wren building tie in the colors of the OI because I am a thoroughgoing company man. So even though Pennsylvania is where I'm from, Virginia still has my heart when we get to this stupid Civil War that I'm going to be talking about. Okay, let's get started. Over the past 20 years, my research has focused on the question of belonging and citizenship, of inclusion and exclusion at the founding of the American Republic. My first book, The Common Cause, centered on the stories patriot political leaders and publicists told about African Americans and Native peoples during the Revolutionary War in order to shore up the immensely fragile union of 13 suspicious, jealous, and unfamiliar colonies. I argued there in the blue one that patriot leaders like Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, and Adams seized upon colonial fears about slave insurrections and Indian massacres and married them to the idea that now their British allies were allying with these frightening forces to destroy the revolution. There I examined the spread of stories in colonial newspapers about British agents tampering with or whispering to or dealing with natives and the enslaved to try to stop the rebellion. I argued that the founding fathers spent a great deal of time and money thinking about, worrying about, and writing about people of color, especially in 1775 and 76, because they thought it would be the best way for the colonial public to overlook or put away those older jealousies, suspicions, and unfamiliarity and come together in a common cause. It solved the problem of union and convinced many colonists to take up arms against their cultural cousins. Race, therefore, I argued, united the states in the first place. And because that founding was also predicated on the embrace of the political theory of citizenship rather than monarchical subjecthood, whereby the people and not a king choose who's in and who's out, who belongs and who doesn't, those stories would have long-lasting consequences, but it was not inevitable. The spread of those stories that centered on race was a very, very contingent thing at the outset of the revolution, and they needed sponsorship and had to be broadcast by certain people in certain ways using certain modes of communication. And I found their method in the newspapers, in the mundane and everyday assemblage of spare paragraphs found inside the pages of colonial newspapers. And the colonial newspapers are my jam. They might not seem cool to you, but there's quite a lot in them, and they were the key to my first two book projects, the ones I was just showing you. And one newspaper in particular was also the genesis of my recent book, Heart of American Darkness. So, this is a colonial newspaper. Man, is it boring, right? This is the front page and the back page of the 19th of July, 1776, the Virginia Gazette, published right here in Williamsburg. And inside is more of the same boring. In fact, you see that what's encircled there in the middle of that page on the left is part of the text of the Declaration of Independence, right? You wouldn't know it, but there's no headlines, there's no pictures of any kind. It's just mind-blowingly numb to try to focus on these things. So when I got to this, which was published 250 years ago, Thursday, I said, okay, here's another one of these boring things. What's going on here? Well, that's different and new. I've never seen that before. That is an almost whole column-sized illustration and engraving diagram of a funeral procession. So I got super interested in this, which frankly got my attention. I'd never seen anything like it before. It was an arresting graphic display of a funeral procession that wound through the streets of New York City, on October 1775, 250 years ago last week. So I was very curious, who is this guy? Who's the guy in the coffin? And the obituary at the top said the dead guy, and you probably can't read this super well, so I'll tell you what's important about it. It's kind of blurry. The dead guy was a 28-year-old man named Michael Cressup. He was actually 33. They got that wrong. The eldest son of Colonel Thomas Cressup of Potomac in Virginia. He was the captain of a rifle company, now in the Continental Army in Boston, and was a captain in Virginia's recent war against the Shawnee. British Shawnee. And quote, by his prudence, firmness, and intrepidity as a brave officer, who gave proofs of his attachment to the rights and liberties of his country, we are deprived of a worthy and esteemed citizen. Whoa, this sounded like one impressive dude. I wanted to find out more about him, so I began digging, and it became quite a story. It's actually quite a complicated story, so please bear with me, I'll do my best. Thomas Cressup, the dead guy's father, was born in England around the turn of the 18th century and came to Maryland sometime in his 20s. He married a woman from Baltimore County and moved around the Chesapeake a little bit. At one point, he rented a house from Augustine Washington, George's father. In 1730, he bought a parcel of land on the western bank of the Susquehanna in what he thought was Maryland. He established a plantation there called Pleasant Garden, and opened a ferry service across the river. Others followed, and their insistence that this was Maryland and not Pennsylvania would escalate into a violent episode of boundary warfare. Over the next few years, Cressup and his neighbors engaged in several pitched battles over whether this was Maryland or Pennsylvania. People died. Warrants were sworn out. Houses were burned, including Cressup's house, which is right at the very bottom of this bank, and that's overlooking the Susquehanna River there. Marauding bands of militia stalked both sides of this river in the 1730s. Thomas Cressup was arrested and clapped into the Philadelphia jail, where he said one of the funniest things that I've known in 18th century American history. When he was on the cart going into Philadelphia, he said to the man driving the cart, "Damn it, this is the prettiest town in Maryland." Finally, it got so bad, King George II got involved, and eventually the proprietor families, the Penns and the Calverts, established a commission to draw a boundary line. 30 years later, when Mason and Dixon came to draw that boundary line, they would spend the night at Thomas Cressup's new house on the Potomac River. For after getting out of the Philadelphia jail, Thomas had had enough of this nonsense and packed his family off further to the west, to the place line of my phone there. And you see it says Colonel Cressup's right here. Colonel Cressup's, there it is. Great Warrior's Path and the two bears. This is a nice spot. They had barely settled into their new frontier spot in 1742 when Thomas's wife, Hannah, gave birth to their third son, Michael, the guy who's going to end up in the coffin. The controversy seemed to follow the Cressups. Over the 1740s and 50s, lots and lots of people started paying attention to that mountainous part of the world. Frontier settlers like the Cressups from Maryland and Virginia and Pennsylvania, French military strategists and imperial agents, native peoples like the Shawnee, Delaware, and Mingo, who were either returning to the Ohio Valley after migrating out of it a few generations before, or coming there for the first time. The area just to the west of this spot, the Ohio River Valley, was not just a frontier for Europeans, it was a frontier for everyone. And lots of people were dreaming in 1750 of controlling Ohio as the way to secure their interests and make their dreams come true. 5 generations before there was a scramble for Africa, there was a scramble for Ohio. Who would control the forks of the Ohio River, today Pittsburgh, where they used to play football right over there pretty well. Fortunately not anymore. As most of you know, sparked what we really should call World War I, the global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. And in America, it has the rather misleading name of the French and Indian War, which lasted from 1754 to 1763. And Thomas Cresap was a key factor in starting this war. In fact, most of the major players in this conflict would spend the night at Cresap's outpost on the Potomac. George Washington several times, and General Edward Braddock, along with their troops before they met their disaster at the Monongahela in 1755. Teenaged Michael Cresap saw the devastation as natives attacked settlements all around them after the French and natives defeated Washington and then Braddock's redcoats. Neighbors would seek refuge in their Potomac stone house. The fighting killed his older brother in 1757. Michael and his father would come upon the corpse of his older brother in the wooded mountains near his home, but only after animals had half devoured his corpse. This traumatic, painful war would continue for years, long past when Europeans negotiated peace in Paris in 1763. That summer, Ben Franklin's Philadelphia newspaper reported how a 21-year-old Michael scalped an Indian who was killed in his front yard raiding their compound. And that episode was a tiny part of the fighting known as Pontiac's War that raged all throughout the area, yet again devastating colonial settlements and forcing settlers to flee east. In the years after the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's War, Michael ventured further west, now in his early 20s. The French were defeated, but King George had proclaimed the lands west of the Allegheny Mountains off limits to colonial settlement. But Michael went anyway, establishing a store on the Ohio River in what is today Wheeling, West Virginia by 1770. And he was one of several thousand colonists illegally moving into the area. He's stabilizing relations with natives and producing nightmares for imperial officials who felt caught in the middle. At the start of the 1770s in the Ohio region, things were very, very, very messy, even worse than before. Like the pickle Michael's father found himself in a generation before, no one knew whose territory this was. Virginia said it was part of their charter rights, go Wren Building. Pennsylvania said it belongs to them. For the purposes of clarity, I won't get into all the other different claimants, but there are bunches. We have the Ohio Company and the Vandalia Company and the Indiana Company and the Suffering Traders claim, et cetera, et cetera. This is crazy town in the 1770s. And all of it, of course, is beyond the proclamation line of 1763. Speculators and settlers ignored that policy to such a degree in the years after Pontiac's War that imperial officials scrambled and fumbled and searched for ways to keep the peace to prevent the outbreak of yet another brutally expensive war in the American backcountry, which is something that they definitely don't want because Britain is broke. This is the imperial crisis after all. So, in 1772, to save money, they pulled anyone who might enforce order, i.e. red-coated soldiers, out of Fort Pitt and sent them east, and then chaos really ensues. The governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, sends a representative to Pittsburgh to claim it for them. The governor of Pennsylvania sends a representative to Pittsburgh to claim it for them. Pittsburgh is both Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, and West Augusta County, Virginia. They fight, they throw each other in jail, they send posses back and forth to intimidate one another. And meanwhile, tensions are rising among some of the Ohio natives who see this power vacuum, the Shawnee and the Mingo especially, and they are unhappy with how all the attempts to protect their lands and restrain settlement have been ignored. They are unhappy with more and more colonists like Michael Cresap encroaching on their lands they thought were promised to them. In 1774, in April, as the ship is crossing the Atlantic bearing news of how the Crown is going to respond to news of Bostonians dumping tea into the harbor, the set of punitive measures known as the Coercive Acts, the situation in Pittsburgh devolves into civil war, street fighting, and murder. In the last days of April, as that ship came within sight of Boston, a few traders got waylaid on the shore of the Ohio River. Virginia's man on the scene recognized this crisis as a potential opportunity and issued a circular letter warning any settlers in the region of imminent war with the Ohio natives. Michael Cresap took immediate action. He jumped into action. He was near Wheeling, West Virginia, 87 miles downriver from Pittsburgh, when the letter reached him on April 27th, 1774. He immediately fired on natives he saw coming down the Ohio River in a canoe and killed them. He ambushed a second canoe later that day, killing another. And 3 days later, on April 30th, something very terrible happened 45 miles to the north of Michael Cressup, about halfway between Wheeling and Pittsburgh. There, Yellow Creek empties into the Ohio. In the last days of April, there had been shots fired in anger at this spot, with colonial settlers crossing the river from east to west to shoot at an encampment of Mingos on the Yellow Creek, about a mile sort of past where I took this picture. As an apparent sign of goodwill, some settlers invited a small number of Mingos to come over to Baker's Tavern on the east side of the river for a drink to show that there were no hard feelings. Today, this is just the back of the parking lot that surrounds the casino, Mountaineer Casino and Racetrack. You can see it up here. Oop, there's the casino and racetrack. There we go. And if you do a little bit of mild trespassing and kind of climb a few fences, you can go to the spot where this is now. This picture is taken from that spot, sort of right on the opposite side. Today, that's West Virginia. There, 5 Mingo men and a woman and her child took them up on this gesture and paddled a mile down Yellow Creek and came across this river right there. What happened next is a matter of some conjecture, since most of our reliable net collected from memories of those who heard about it decades after the fact, but this is what we think happened. The Mingo men shared a drink with a handful of colonists, and then someone suggested a shooting contest as a friendly game of competition. Although this was offered as a sign of goodwill, it was really a trap. Once the Mingo men emptied their guns, a party of at least a dozen men, led by Daniel Greathouse, leapt out of their hiding places in a room unknown in the back of the tavern and charged forward. The Mingo tried to run to their canoes. Greathouse's men shot down the men first, and then one older woman, and then a younger woman holding her infant turned around when she got to the water's edge, begged for mercy, and was clutching her infant child. And she claimed that the child's father was a white traitor, and please spare them both. The assailants took the baby from her and then shot her in the forehead. When the shooting started, a few more unfortunate Mingo were already on their way across the river, were suddenly caught. Greathouse's party shot them down too, killing 2 more men, and another woman ducking down in her canoe was seriously wounded. Only the baby lived. Greathouse's men had killed 8 Mingo Indians in a cold-blooded, premeditated attack. Now, they didn't know it, probably. It's possible they knew it, but probably not. Greathouse and his accomplices had brutally murdered the mother, brother, and sister of one of the most prominent Native leaders of that particular time and place. They had killed the family of Logan. And I can talk at length about them. The Heart of American Darkness turned out to be something that caught me off guard, which was, it turned out to be kind of a dual biography of the Cressup family and the Shekellemy family, of which that is Logan's family. One of the most important Native ambassadors in colonial history is the Shekellemies, and because they are so prominent, I was able to kind of write a biography where we know so many of the details about the Native side of it that it almost rises to the level of a dual biography. We can talk about that later. I'll stick to the Cressups for now. In the weeks that followed, Logan took his revenge for this massacre at Yellow Creek, raiding settlements and attacking villages all throughout the region, from just south of Pittsburgh all the way down to what is today southern West Virginia and even into East Tennessee. When Logan felt his vengeance was satisfied, he announced it in a speech that would become internationally famous, called Logan's Lament. In that speech, Logan explicitly refers to Colonel Cressup, as the murderer of his family, which is the name of, starts this long chain of confusion because Colonel Cressup is actually his father's honorific. But he blames Cressup as a cold-blooded and unprovoked murderer of all of his relations. And this met up actually with the popular reportage of the Yellow Creek Massacre. Newspaper accounts in the East blamed Michael for the Yellow Creek Massacre. He didn't do it, but they blamed him nonetheless, and especially pointed out how he had announced he would put to death any Indian he could find on the river. As one report put it, the destruction lately effected by the son of Colonel Cressup is likely to be productive of consequences fatal to many people in the backcountry. Quote, "We have too many reasons to apprehend that those mischiefs will terminate in an Indian war." And they did. The most staunch patriot papers in Boston and Philadelphia referred to the Yellow Creek attack as barbarous murders. No other name I can give it. And named Cressup as the perpetrator. Another New York paper said this: "We are informed that Colonel Cressup of Potomac with a party of Virginians has killed 39 Ohio Indians in revenge for some murders committed sometime on the Ohio." Further details next week. Yikes. Many accounts predicted that the violence along the Ohio would escalate into a very hot Indian war, and they were right. Virginia's governor, Lord Dunmore, saw his opportunity to secure his colony's claims to lands beyond the mountains. So he ordered militias to muster and appointed officers, Michael Cressup included, and he personally went to supervise what became known as Dunmore's War. It climaxed on October 10th, 1774, with a battle at Point Pleasant, where the Kanawha River joins the Ohio in current-day southern West Virginia. Although more Virginians died than Shawnee or Mingo, it was a decisive fight. And Dunmore returned to Williamsburg in January 1775, fancying himself a hero. And he also brought back with him copies of Logan's Lament. 35 years later, Thomas Jefferson still remembered the splash Logan's speech made in Williamsburg. In 1797, Jefferson wrote, "These words were so affecting and the speech itself so fine a morsel of eloquence that it became the theme of every conversation. It flew through all the public papers of the continent and even through the magazines and other periodical publications of Great Britain." For Jefferson, this was the perfect statement of the noble savage. Logan tried to find peace. He never felt fear. He was kind and hospitable, but fierce when his family was slaughtered. And Jefferson probably didn't know, or maybe he did, I don't know, how steeped it was in scripture. It begins with obvious influence from the Song of Moses and Deuteronomy and from Matthew 25:35, which says, "For when I was hungry, he gave me meat. When I was thirsty, he gave me drink. When I was stranger, you took me in, naked and clothed me." That's the King James Version. You'll see if you read the top of this, that's what Logan is referencing at the top of this speech. But it's the haunting final line. Who is there to mourn for Logan? Not one. That's what appealed to Jefferson's Enlightenment sensibility. So he copied the speech down in his commonplace book, and then he would feature it in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, where he prefaced the speech with a comment that Cressup was a, quote, "a man infamous for many murders he had committed on those much injured people. So Logan blames Michael Cressup. Jefferson blames Michael Cressup. British officials and army officers exchange all sorts of letters saying it's all his fault. All the stuff that's bad stuff that's happening all summer long into the fall of 1774, it's that guy's fault. They blamed him for Yellow Creek. They called him a murderer. They said he was part of a gang of worse savages. His name was all over America in the summer of 1774 as the primary reason why there was yet another Indian war in the backcountry. So, what's going on here? Remember where this story started? What started me on this quest? October 1775, 1 year to the day exactly of Logan's Lament. He's being called a worthy and esteemed citizen. He's being carried through the streets of New York. If George Washington would have died in October of 1775 in Manhattan, this is the same size funeral that GW would have had. In fact, the president of Congress that same week drops dead at dinner, and they talk about what his funeral was like in Philadelphia. This is the exact same sized pomp and affair in the streets of Philadelphia and New York City for this guy. And Michael Cressup's never been to New York before. He's a total stranger in this town. Something's going on here. What happened? Well, to make a long story short, In that exact year between those two events, the Revolutionary War began. His redemption began when Cresap answered his country's call. Immediately upon hearing the news of the battles of Lexington and Concord, Cresap assembled a rifle company and started walking from the Ohio River to Boston. And there were a few groups of these men who made what became the instantly legendary march of 600 miles in 24 days, known as the Beeline March to Boston. And there was enormous newspaper coverage of their journey to Boston, especially Cresap's unit, actually, with commentary on what these frontiersmen looked like and acted like. These riflemen were America's secret weapon against British redcoats. They looked and acted like natives. They seemed to be coming to America's rescue, to liberty's rescue. These are our supermen. You want to talk about wartime transformations? Suddenly, Cresap's reputation transformed utterly and completely. And here is where my previous work on the larger stories in revolutionary newspapers comes in. If you know how frequently people all throughout the 13 colonies in the summer of 1775 are reading about stories of British negotiating with Indians and potentially allying themselves together to try to attack the frontier. And you couple that with how staunch these frontiersmen seem in the cause, you have sort of the formula for what's going on here. Now, men like Michael Cresap, or we could change his name to Daniel Boone, they're not worse than savages. They're America's secret weapons. They are now worthy and esteemed citizens. And this helps explain Cresap's lavish funeral, I think. Why New Yorkers would cotton to this man just months after calling him rather terrible names in their own newspapers. And it suggests something fundamental about the stories told at the moment of revolution, how flexible and fungible reputations could be. In some instances, like the French, for example, the revolution could do these kinds of topsy-turvy shakeups. The French go from hated enemy to savior allies. In other instances, like for African Americans or Native peoples, they did not. This is revolution time. In his landmark 1975 book, The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolutions, David Bryan Davis talks about what happens during revolution time. He calls it a time of creation, marked by contingency, fears, and openness. It is a time of uncertainty and confusion, and a moment that was ripe for tremendous reevaluation of all sorts of things. Lots and lots of stories sponsored by patriot leaders about slaves and Indians working for the king reinforced ideas about who belonged to the new American Republic and who didn't. Those stories created villains like Dunmore or others working with the enslaved or native peoples, but the patriots also needed heroes. And that's where Michael Cresap comes in. Now he goes instantaneously from Indian killer to America's savior. And actually, those things now become the same thing. The obituary tells the tale. It combines the killing of natives in Ohio in 1774 and the potential killing of redcoats in Boston in 1775 as twin, inseparable actions that the revolution needs desperately in this particular moment. Now, I've been thinking about this guy and this family for a long time. When I first came across the Cresap funeral diagram in 2002, that wasn't just about this dramatic transformation of Michael Cresap's reputation, but a much larger and expansive story. And I definitely wanted to develop the history of Logan and his family, which because of their prominence, I was able to do, I think, unlike nearly all Native families in the 18th century. But I struggled with how to tell this story. It is horrendous and ghastly and so intriguing. And it's a very challenging and twisting story to tell. The main character drops dead. There's loads of mistaken identity. People change sides. The maps are wrong. The boundaries are wrong. Confusion abounds. And P.S., I haven't even done the story's twists at all full justice. After Jefferson puts Logan's Lament in his book, That's going to fix the idea about who's at fault for Yellow Creek for generations of Americans, and Cressup's extended family is going to battle this for all throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. And Jefferson's political enemies are going to say that getting this story wrong should disqualify you for president of the United States. Can you imagine if that were the case? Getting a mistake wrong in your book means you're not allowed to be president. Oh, how naive we were. Okay. America's school children are going to memorize and recite Logan's Lament for decades into the 19th century. It's 20 words shorter than the Gettysburg Address, which makes it a perfect student exercise. Millions of boys, and almost all these boys, are going to memorize Logan's words for a century. The Yellow Creek Massacre, Logan's Lament, Michael Cressup became staples of American culture, partly because of Jefferson, at least until the Civil War. They're in the McGuffey's Readers, they're in all sorts of things that kids are learning about. But the bigger problem for me was how to do more than just narrate the story, as fascinating as it was, but how to put it into some sort of historiographical frame. What I wanted to, especially to do, is what I think is one of the things that we try to do as historians. I wanted to try to capture what contingency feels like. We talk all the time about contingency. By the end of every semester, my undergrads are already over it. I'm always like, what's my favorite word? They're like, contingency. But what does that feel like? How do we narrate that? I mean, how are we ever going to convey what March 2020 felt like? Right? You remember? How can we capture what that feeling was like? The uncertainty, the bewilderment, the vacuum of authority and responsibility of not knowing anything about what's going to happen in the next 3 hours. What's the next push notification on your phone going to be? What did that feel like? How are we going to ever be able to try to narrate that 100 years from now? So that's what I was trying to sort of capture. Now, here's where the insanity part of the runs in my family might come into your minds. So let's just bear with me here. So I was teaching at that time a lot. And I sort of thought that my teaching job would come to my rescue. In my first teaching appointment, I had to teach multiple sections of modern world history, the world since 1789. And for the imperialism section of that class, I would consistently use Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and usually using it in concert with Chinua Achebe a few weeks later to talk about kind of the imperialism and decolonization and what that actually means in Africa. And over, when I would discuss Conrad's novella with my students, I would leave the classroom with a nagging feeling that what Heart of Darkness was getting at was not just limited to Central Africa at the end of the 19th century. Now, I don't mean the larger questions about human nature that our good friends in the English department would draw from it. What I do mean is what it shows and tells us about the historical experience of empire. Heart of Darkness was published as a novella in 1902, after being serialized in Blackwood's magazine a couple of years before. It is based on Conrad's own experience of going to the Congo in 1890 as part of a Belgian trading company venture. It is always portrayed as a very alien story, a story about wild jungles and what they do to a person. Look at the covers that art designers have chosen for the book over the years. They always have a very African feel to them, the foreboding African jungle, or the art relates depravity, the gaunt skeleton staring at us with haunted red eyes, or absurdity, the gunship firing cannonballs at elephants. At any rate, it's weird, and it's definitely not us. And Francis Ford Coppola realized this too. He set his epic 1979 film Apocalypse Now, not in the African jungles, but in the Southeast Asian ones, and swapped the Congo River for ones in Vietnam. To convey the derangement and bewilderment of the American war in Vietnam, Coppola had to change very little to plot or character. But in Apocalypse Now, the foreignness remains. This is something that happens out there. The absurdity, the irrationality, the depravity, the horror All of this is what happens to civilized people when they are exposed to savage places and savage people. It certainly isn't the United States, but not so fast. Maybe hold on. Heart of Darkness is a story of empire on the make, exploitation and cruelty, death and derangement, of a strange river that opens up lands of potential and desire, of reputations made, lost, and redeemed out there. And every term that I taught that book in world history, I felt like left the classroom thinking, man, this feels like a familiar story to me. It felt like the story of the Ohio River in the middle of the 18th century. Now, my first encouragement of thinking about how perhaps I could apply Conrad's vision of empire to America, about how to domesticate what he portrayed, came from Joseph Conrad himself. So don't blame me, blame the man himself. The very first word spoken in the book, when Marlowe, the narrator, says abruptly out loud to the small group of men gathered up on the ship's deck, the first word spoken in the book says, "And this also has been one of the dark places of the earth." Now, he's not referring to the Congo. He means the Thames River running through central London. Through Marlowe, Conrad says that now in the 19th century, in 1900, we think of the Thames differently. What greatness had not floated on the ebb of that river into the mystery of an unknown earth, the dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, the germs of empire. But it hasn't always been so. When ancient Roman soldiers were sent to Britain 2,000 years ago, it was the far-flung frontier, the edges of what they thought was civilization. Imagine him here, says Marlowe, the very end of the world, the sea the color of lead, the sky the color of smoke, sandbanks, marshes, forests, savages, precious little to eat fit for a civilized man, nothing but Thames water to drink. For that Roman soldier, it was the same. Land in a swamp, march through the woods, and in some inland post feel the savagery, the utter savagery had closed all around him. Conrad means what you are about to read is not exclusive to Central Africa or the 19th century. It is transferable. And this transference has always fascinated me as a thought exercise when I would teach this book. So, the Upper Ohio Valley in the middle of the 18th century. It is a tribal liminal zone for everyone, Europeans and natives alike. It's a very sought after place for everyone, Europeans and natives alike. It's a place that lots of people are dreaming about controlling, salivating over how to exploit it, how to make themselves richer. It's bisected by a river that holds the key to imperial greatness. Now, that's not how we often think about the Ohio, of course. Ohio is the Hautenosaunee's name for the river. The French called it La Belle Rivière, the beautiful river. It usually has a mythical quality in early American culture, sometimes even excelling that of the Mississippi. In 19th century narratives, it's a river of progress, carrying pioneers westward toward a manifest American destiny, or it's a river of freedom. Those who cross against its current and head north escape slavery. But when Marlowe refers to the Thames as carrying forth the dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, and the germ of empires, that is a near perfect description of how we often think of the Ohio. But that doesn't fully encapsulate the river's history. The Ohio has also been one of the dark places of the earth. And thinking about the Yellow Creek Massacre and the Crescent family and the Logan family and how these people's reputations ebbed and flowed, I began to think with Conrad in mind to explore the roots of and persistent blindness to America's darkness. When Conrad has Marlowe state that the conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. Now that is an American story, one that we must come to terms with. Events like what happened to Yellow Creek and people like Michael Cressup do live at the heart of the American experience, and we need to understand and perceive these stories. So what? To conclude, there's another writer who came to prominence in the 1890s. His name is Frederick Jackson Turner. Turner, who was 4 years older than Conrad, famously proclaimed in 1893 that the frontier was the secret to American character, democracy, and individualism, and it all started in the Ohio Valley. Turner crafted a process argument whereby the inexorable process of taming the wilderness, of bringing it into capitalistic husbandry, of creating households and drafting laws is what made America great. After World War II, scholars critiqued the Turner thesis, of course, pointing to all the people that the Wisconsin historian had left out, and emphasized instead place over process. Since the 1980s, we've gotten middle grounds, native grounds, borderlands, and bordered lands, each of these offering a different interpretation that says what happened in a particular place cannot be transferred or transposed across the continent. But more recently, however, process seems to be making a bit of a comeback. Theorists of settler colonialism, first propagated by scholars from Australia to depict what happened to indigenous peoples there, have come to prominence. Settler colonialism, they argue, constitutes a double dispossession. Not only did European colonists settle upon indigenous lands in America, but as they moved on to native land, they secured their occupation by eliminating native culture and history and any traces that they were not the rightful justified owners of that ground. And it's the second half of the process, the cultural obliteration of native identity, that is the hallmark of settler colonial theory. The story of Logan and Cresap in the 19th century certainly fits into that, and it's a powerful example of that double dispossession of settler colonialism. But how it ended up in that place is something historians must investigate. Not all, but some subscribers to settler colonial theory imply that there is an irresistible force, a process there that will engulf everyone. And in so doing, they kind of rely strangely on a Turnerian inevitability. And this is where the historians are so critical. We need to be, but I also think we need to be creative and perhaps take some risks in trying to interpret and narrate what happened in the past. So here's my risks. What I'm suggesting is to go back to the 1890s and draft a very different vision of empire, one that rejects inevitability and irresistible process. If we get comfortable with the incomprehensible, if we embrace the bewilderment, absurdity, and horror of the Ohio frontier in the 18th century, we can restore the feeling of contingency and hopefully interpret the history of the backcountry in new ways. And this involves thinking about bewilderment as a historical force. Now, I would like to offer thinking about bewilderment as a force of history in two ways. One, as a state of mind, the sheer unknowing of lines and authorities and power and politics, or friends and enemies, of the incomprehensibility of those years and those places in particular. And that's enough. We could do that. But I also think we should redouble our efforts to try to restore what that must have felt like. But I feel like we could go further, to think about bewilderment as also a state of play, of actors recognizing that incomprehensibility and then trying to turn it to their advantage, to leverage power through the bafflement and unknowing. And in that way, we can start to think about how people try to make the best of these situations, and helps us to understand how power works in fresh ways. And it is essential that we do so. For this history is critical to understanding the United States. In Heart of Darkness, Conrad confesses something that everyone could agree on. Frederick Jackson Turner, the proponents of grounds, borders, borderlands, and theorists of settler colonialism all. Absurdity, exploitation, and cruelty of imperialism not only changed him forever, but it changed everything around him, how he saw the Thames River as much as the Congo River. Colonialism still throws a kind of light on everything about the United States, and we should try to strive and tell and listen to these stories. We need to search for new ways to think about what happened along the Ohio River in the middle of the 1700s, because both the light and the darkness that came from those encounters is still all around us all the time now. There is perhaps no more central a place in American society than the corner of Broadway and Wall Streets in New York City. Trinity Church, built originally in the 1690s, sits at this address, at the intersection of these two storied streets around the corner from the former World Trade Center towers. And in its just as storied graveyard lies Alexander Hamilton, Robert Fulton, John Jacob Astor, and many other names you know. But right up against that building lies another man, a stranger to New Yorkers, a man who was alternatively known, as Jefferson would refer to him, as a man infamous for many murders on the frontier, but also known as a worthy and esteemed citizen. There, Michael Cressip's grave has sat continuously at the corner of two of the most storied streets in American culture. And in 1867, as the marker reached its centennial birthday, the Trinity Church wardens paid for a replica to be cast and sent the original to the New York Historical Society for safekeeping. Today, you can see it on display at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. We need to tell these stories, to understand them, to know where we are, where we came from. Marlowe tells us, we live in the flicker. May it last as long as the old earth keeps rolling. But by that he means the flicker of a lightning flash. That's how we think, how we try to stay alert in the present. We live in the flicker. But darkness was here yesterday. And this domestication of Conrad's vision of empire, of becoming comfortable with, of sitting with and embracing the bewilderment and incomprehensibility of imperial encounter, I think pays significant interpretive and historiographic dividends. Now, oh, there we go. Okay, so it's like, and now what? Okay.
We have time for questions. We do have time for questions.
It's not up to me. I'm not running things. All right, O'Malley.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. Which is very thought-provoking. My question is a simple one. If in that moment after the massacre, everyone was saying he was murdered, why was there no trial?
Oh. There are no, I don't think there are any trials. Yeah, I think things just spiral to a great degree, and within weeks he's commissioned an officer. Not only is there no trial, but you know, a handful of years before that, there are terrible murders on the Susquehanna River. There's some ironclad murders. There's no trial. I mean, some people are arrested, but they get broken out of jail. I don't think that's so crazy that you said that, right? Because I don't remember anybody even raising that as a possibility that there would be justice held for. What happens is everyone tries. What's also really fascinating about this, what is remembered about Yellow Creek is the screams of pain. Even the perpetrators tell other people about the wails that they heard from Native women on the other side of the river screaming about what has happened. And it kind of haunted them, and they told a bunch of people about it. But in the weeks after that, there was a lot of kind of clamor for going to war on all sides, and what people tried to do was get quiet. But there's no kind of question about justice. It just seems to be a criminal case wouldn't even have entered into it. Yeah. Be loud.
Wondering how closely you think we could analogize Conrad's experiences in the Congo with what was going on along the Ohio, because here we have discussions from agents of Leopold or agents of a specific company.
Right.
We're talking about how they had free reign to do whatever they wanted. They set themselves up.
Right.
And with, well, there seems to be more of an incentive or respect for the need to set up structures in the settlement.
Oh, I don't think in the 60s and 70s that's the case. There are, I mean, you could call people like John Connolly in Pittsburgh a warlord, and that would actually make him happy. He would be really impressed with that. I mean, he sees himself as a captain commandant. Warlord would actually just add to his feelings about how important he is. But the idea that this is a profit motive, that's what's going on here, and that's driving this whole region of speculation throughout the 60s and 70s. There's probably more structure by the time we get to the 1890s, right? But I think a lot of the same elements hold as far as what people want out of the land and how they're going to bring the resources out of it who are the reasonable receivers of that wealth.
Thank you very much. This was a great talk. I wanted to ask about any possible religious dimensions as far as Crescent's motivations, the way that he was viewed. You know, I'm sort of thinking about like the Paxton Boy as sort of sectarian associations.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of my question. Like, especially the way that Jefferson is looking at them and all of that. I know that area is sort of known for its religious diversity and such.
Not as far as I know, there is no reference to any kind of religious anything with the Crescents as far as I know. I can't remember a single thing except for getting married in a church. Michael and his wife get married in a church they get married in Philadelphia. But that's one thing that I know of. Everything else, not even in the wills they don't even talk about. I mean, it seems to be entirely out, which is very strange.
It's remarkable.
It's remarkable. Yeah. It's very not even any kind of justification as sort of a Christian crusade. Logan talks about a lot more about religion. I mean, there's an encounter right before this when one of the only it's interesting. We know of what Logan looked like from exactly one 9-year-old's recollection about 50 years later, 40 years later. And that 9-year-old is terrified because Logan and his brother and another native show up at his family's, show up and ask for some food, and he's terrified they're going to kill him. It's not long after coming. And so they have this very, very, very anxious and sort of scary encounter, of which this 9-year-old's father says, "You guys should read the Bible." And Logan says, "What makes you think we don't know the Bible?" Right. We know very well. And again, you see it all over. Right. That's so that has come up with Logan and Shekel. I mean, it's even way more than the rest of that. It's like Greg's question, like, oh, no, like I don't know, like it never has even it never entered into the evidence that I looked at. Yeah. I think we have one over there. Oh, here. All right, here, and then
Hi, Rob. John Nelson here. So this is maybe an in the weeds question, but it goes back to Logan's rhetoric and the laments that become so famous. And I think it gets at kind of the same bewilderment thing.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to read it in the book, but there is controversy over the lament itself too, correct?
Right.
And so is your sense that Logan does give the lament in his words and it gets transcribed that way?
Yes.
Because there's all these alternative theories about Gibson or
Yes.
these other people
Right.
making it up, and Jefferson kind of gets
Yes.
tied into that later when he republishes it.
Yes.
So I'm interested to hear your take on it.
Yeah. So it sounds like I think it's a speech a Shekelani would give. Whether or not these are the exact words is hard to know. So, and so the translator of that speech actually is the father of the baby who survives the Yellow Creek. That's John Gibson, who becomes the interpreter of that speech and who's the go-between between Dunmore and Logan at that time. And what's also fascinating too is John Gibson's nephew is going to be the man who is in charge of, he's the commissary general for the U.S. Army from 1815 to 1860. And so all of the receipts for Indian removal go to that guy's desk, George Gibson's desk, actually Fort Gibson's in Oklahoma as a sort of the other end of Indian removal. So the Gibson family is also kind of a fascinating part of it. I think that the speech of the Shekelani would give because he talks about how haunted he is. And there's another note that he writes. We can talk about this for a while over drinks, Johnny. That he writes the summer before that kind of presupposes or sort of previews, I guess is the word, the Logan's Lit, where he says, my family has tried their damnedest to get along with people, and now it's finally broken me. And so it is. So I think that Shekelani is finding this is the last straw in a lot of ways. His family has, since the Shekelanis are involved in the Walking Purchase, that their relationship with James Logan, the Pennsylvania agent, the orchestrator, that's why they have the name Logan, that the father gives his two older sons this other honorific name to celebrate that kind of marriage between Pennsylvania and Iroquois. They are trying their best to get along, and then finally, he mentions what happens with the Paxton boys, that those are referred to as his kin to. The question about the veracity of Logan's lament comes from Luther Martin, who marries Michael Cressip's daughter, and he's also he hates Thomas Jefferson with every ounce of his being. He's an anti-federalist, and so his only reason, his only evidence for why it couldn't be Logan is racism. A savage could never give a speech like this. End of story, done. And Luther Martin is the guy who says Jefferson can't possibly be qualified to run for president. And it does actually freak Jefferson out. He's vice president. And much of what we know from Yellow Creek is Jefferson writing himself to all these other witnesses saying, did I get this wrong? And remind me. And in the 1800 version of Laws of the State of Virginia, there's what's called a Logonian appendix that's attached to the end of it. Jefferson's never going to answer this guy in the newspaper. That's not his style. But he publishes an appendix to the end of the Laws of the State of Virginia, which corrects some of these things. But that controversy is going to go on and on and on. Mark's going to hate it forever. Yeah.
I don't have to do it. All right, excellent. I just want to say how fantastic this was for the interview. Everybody, no matter what type of historian you are, something to think about.
Thank you.
I also want to say that.
But
I also want to say that I'm someone who works in Deaf Ways in Early America. That's one of my favorite type of sources when they have the diagram.
Oh.
And I've never seen that one, so thank you. What I do want to ask you has to do with President and that quick turnaround of his that rehab of his image.
yeah.
And I was curious if there's anybody who's sort of supporting this, driving it. You know, does he have like a hype guy?
Yeah.
And if so, what is he doing in this process to make it possible to turn around so tight?
Right. So it's thinking about some of the contingency stuff too, right? So Michael Cressip gets malaria in Kentucky in July of 1775. Before he walks, so he walks. This is not nothing, right? He walks 600 miles, and he kind of has to tell somebody else, I think I'm gonna die. Like he's really ill. He's like, and he also says, but if I don't go to Boston, my dad's gonna go. So I got him. He's like, I'm stuck. And Thomas is like 80 something at this point, but he actually probably would have gone. It's kind of crazy. But so Michael has malaria and he gets to Boston and he's already feeling sick. So he walks 600 miles with malaria, which would probably kill all of us. And I think about like if he dies how does the story change? He goes to the Peacock Tavern. What if he dies at the Peacock Tavern? And the fact that he goes to New York is so important because New York is not very flush with patriotism in the revolution. It is not like Philadelphia and Boston. There's a lot of loyalists in New York. So the hype guy are the patriots in New York who realize they have a dead celebrity on their hands, and now they get to shape his funeral and be able to show, like, have all these guys walk the streets of Manhattan and show all those glories that we are staunch in the cause. And so, had that happened somewhere else, I think it would have probably very much different. And there are different funerals, and there's also a second funeral later on in Maryland too. So there's this ripple effect. And boy, does that coverage of this guy's funeral go all over North America. Newspapers throughout the colonies pick up on this guy, and no one says. I mean, they probably do to like their husbands and wives, like this guy. Remember this guy? We'll talk about this guy. This guy was crazy last year. Now he's fantastic. There's this redemption. Probably struck some people as strange if they remember, which I think they probably did. So I think New York. So New York is the hype guy. Okay. Patriots in New York is the hype guy. That's really important.
Okay, fantastic talk, thank you. One of the things I'm struck by in it is, if I've got the timing right, 1774, the military massacre.
Yeah.
And Jefferson's aboard. And just 2 years later, he's writing about the merciless Indian savages.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I know what you're saying, that there's the intervention of war.
Right.
Changes things. But the thing seems to me to be so extreme. I mean, you could absolutely reverse those words. The characters in the merciless is
right.
Yes. So how does that help us understand something about Jefferson? I don't quite know what my question is.
Right. No, I totally agree. I totally agree with you. And I struggle with this too. Right? Because the notion of state of Virginia is after all this has happened.
Right.
So you would think, so I think I can say in the book, like, a careful reader might say, I totally undermine my own case with this. But when you see the other parts of the state of Virginia that are so important, the lionization of the Republican, the yeoman farmers in the notes, that is the driving force of the notes of the state of Virginia, how heroic these guys are. And that, he means Michael Crescent, he means the Daniel Boone's of the world, right? He is thinking about how that's the future of America. And even if he's not thinking that text is going to be so much at their back now. But it does sort of say, well, if the war, what difference does the war make, right? But I think Jefferson is also pulling out this thing from 1775 and trying to justify his case. Jefferson's doing a lot of things in the notes, right? There's a lot going on with those. But I've had that same thought about, well, doesn't that sort of undermine it? But Jefferson doesn't think this way about settlers before 1775, right? He does not think that, he doesn't want to invite, those are not people he wants to invite over to dinner. He doesn't want to hang out with them. But now they become something very, very different and very heroic, and he is really responsible in their transformation. Jeffersonianism is all about redeeming, leveling up, as Peter Ona from the Neck Rodriguez said, these kinds of people. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Great talk, and I'm looking forward to reading your book.
But
well, it's Kelly's point that he gave every kind of historian or something to think about. I'm a Western historian, so warm my heart to see Frederick Jackson Turner up there. It's going to be your students hate contingency by the end of the semester. Mine hate the name of Frederick Jackson Turner and the whole idea of process. But I wanted to ask a question about that. That ties into also this debate about Logan.
Yeah.
If you fast forward about 100 years from Yellow Creek, you get to Joseph's surrender
Yeah.
And his famous "I shall fight no more."
Yep.
Forever, which many historians believe is essentially written by Charles Wilson Scott Wood, who was a army officer. Poet.
Right.
But these orations serve the same purpose.
Disappearing.
Yeah, it's the vanishing meaning, right?
Yeah.
Whether they actually said those words or not, they're twisted by
Yes,
some
absolutely.
writers and set their audiences to have anything they want.
They become the, Logan, I want to interrupt you.
Well, one more thing.
Yeah.
I guess this also goes into your point about settler colonialism as a kind of process marked by the sense of inevitability.
Yeah.
Which of course is what, both these orations are meant to tell white audiences that, this was inevitable, inevitable, it was inevitable.
Yeah.
I guess I wanted you to expand on your critique of settler colonial theory, which might come across in the book, but I haven't read it.
Yeah. Well, I'm of two minds about it, right? Because this, like you're saying, what happens, Logan becomes Logan the Great Mingo Chief, with all capital letters, right? And that's not who this guy was at all. And that concept, which is created to serve the needs of white settlers, is entirely divorced from the experience that he has, from his family, from what happens to him, all of the trauma that he goes through throughout his whole life. Those are two separate things. But the idea of Logan the Great Mingo Chief is an example of that double dispossession. So in the 1830s, there's going to be Logan Historical Societies founded under his elm tree, where he gives a speech. But they're not trying to say, those are examples of what I refer to as pioneer history. They're trying to say all the evidence of the heroic pioneers who go there, and they do it in Logan's name, but they do it very falsely. They're not trying to figure out what happened to Native peoples and why that might have happened in the Big Lake Plains in Ohio at all. So my critique is we have to look very carefully at how this comes to be. How do we get to that? Because in the 19th century, I think we end up in that place, but the road is not a straight one. It is a very, very, and it could change in so many different directions for us to get there. What I say is that at one point, Daniel Boone, the real Daniel Boone, he has an encounter with Logan's war party, and they exchange shots, and he almost gets killed. It's close. And I say, like, if Michael Crescent wouldn't have died in New York, or Daniel Boone would have gotten killed there, the story of the American West would have probably happened, but the darkness would have been different. It wouldn't be exactly the same as we do now. It would have probably, but thinking about how we can tell these stories, we have to be very careful to really pin them into time and place, and be open to thinking about irrationality, maybe, or again, bewilderment as a force that also is a factor in how these things happen. I mean, look, come on. This is the last 10 years. Come on. Anybody making sense of this? Like, bewilderment, man. Like, this is talking about the country kind of just giving credence to how I think, or why I'm thinking like this, right? Maybe it's a teenage daughter, maybe it's America, but I don't know what's going on. Yeah.
Well, speaking of which, it seems to me one of the puzzlements of the last 5 years is how easily people forget.
Yeah.
And is that also part of your bewilderment thing that within a few years it's all over and everybody's forgotten?
Yes. Oh, sure. And purposeful amnesia, right? Things to serve certain ends. That's always kind of a part of all sorts of reputation making, nation making, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's purposeful forgetting is very, very important for some of these things. Go again?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, that's what I want to do.
Thank you. I'm just wondering about the wilderness.
Yeah.
And this is just a quick question, maybe a trivial one.
Yeah.
It comes from wilderness, it comes from directions.
Yes.
How conscious were you of wilderness, of the wilderness and so on?
Some, but thinking about the different, how it, again, what was the real thing that where some focus came in for me was thinking about it in these two different ways. Thinking about it as trying to sit with that uncertainty, and that's okay. I mean, I given a version of this talk at a conference, a small version of this talk at a conference, and Jack Rakoff, the very esteemed constitutional historian, basically yelled at me because he thought this is not possible to be this way. And for him, studying the Constitution and Madison and these kinds of things, well, of course, nothing's bewildering. We know all the answers, even though we don't. And the fact that the notes are actually anyway. But again, certainty is what we do, and I feel a tremendous amount of, uncertainty. There's an appendix in my book that is trying to figure out who Logan was. Because there is a big, long, centuries-long debate about, is he the older brother or the middle brother? Is it James Logan or John Logan? And I go through the whole historiographic, there's a historiographic debate about this every generation, but which one he is. And it also, by the way, happens to matter because guess who kills Logan in 1780 in the middle of the Revolutionary War? His nephew! So it super matters which brother he is. Because we know who it is, his son or his nephew. Anyway, so, and I think about it in terms of, and I'm trying to get the answer here. Can you imagine getting to page like 500 of a Kennedy biography and then have the author say, well, I'm not really sure if this is John or Bobby. Right? I'm not really sure. It could be John, could be Bobby, I don't know. Like, that's also part of that double dispossession, part of that settler colonialism, part of this, where we know so much about these guys, but even then there is this massive amount of haziness and not understanding about who they even are, right? And so bewilderment, I think, seems to be fitting. And I also would like to think about that not just in terms of this particular story, but how we think about that in, even for Madison and the Constitution. How do we get our head around the not being comfortable with the not knowing, and how that plays a factor in all these things. That's very much sort of heresy for the historian, but I like to think about that a bit.
So, a pair of questions. One about the reading part of
Yeah.
and the other about history itself.
Yeah.
As I think about Hard Darkness development, bewilderment is not the primary message that I take from it.
Oh, no, okay.
It's more about attempt to understand and realize what is the real heart of imperialism. And obviously, what culminates with realization of the horror at the heart of colonialism and imperialism.
Right.
And so on the one hand, I wonder what role bewilderment plays in the reading of Hard Darkness. And on the other side, is there a Marlowe in your story?
Oh.
Is there a figure at all?
Yeah.
Is it Jefferson, perhaps? Is it someone else?
No.
That realizes what it is that this
it's me. No, for real. No. So, bewilderment. I mean, everything in that book, Conrad does a. So, what is the heart of imperialism? Do you know what the answer to that is? You don't, because it is actually ambiguous in the book. I mean, and like Kurtz. Kurtz is the famous figure who Marlon Brando plays in the film. He is. Everything about him is actually subverted. So Kurtz being the German word for tall, or very word for short, and he's tall. Like there are everything about it. Marlowe doesn't understand what's going on. The firing gun ships at elephants. The idea of calling people enemies who are clearly not. Like there's all this kind of subversion. There is
Marlowe's eyesight is entirely tricked about fire, and also there's all this kind of there's this doubleness of not knowing in that book. And I don't know if I would say that I know what the horror means at the end of that book, right? I think it's left in many ways undone. Now, I struggled for a long time to try to figure out how to tell this story, and I had all these bad ideas about it, about how to write it, and I had the only part of the novel in the book is the epigrams in the beginning of the chapters, and the chapter titles are sort of drawn from Conrad. Everything else happens in the 18th century. But I had this whole weird thing, and it was my advisor in a Zoom meeting when I couldn't figure it out. He said, "You be Marlowe," and I went, "Oh, that makes more sense." Like that's all you had to say. And so for me, I feel like that's kind of the answer to that is I'm the narrator of that story. So I was able to do that. But yes, Peter Onuf had to say, "You be Marlowe," and I went, "Ah, thanks, dude." That's what I was missing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Okay.
Thank you for a truly wonderful talk. And in some ways crystallized a bunch of themes that I think have been percolating through the last couple of days, at least in the way I've been interpreting things. And one of those, I think, sort of juxtaposes two pieces of your career. When I teach Common Cause and when I think of Common Cause, I did actually make up, I have many graduate students here.
Good. Okay.
I make undergrads in 13 months.
That's fine.
It presents a broad-based ideological understanding of the American Revolution. In other words, thought and ideology and people buying in as an act of choice and an act of thought is really important. Many of the sessions we've had this weekend have emphasized material circumstances, contingency, forced migrations, contingent choices, all of that, which is very much more of the other side of if this is in this book, right?
Yeah.
And so thinking about the revolution as a moment that we teach and talk about both as a transformative ideological moment where ideas really matter and as something highly contingent. I'm curious how you bring those two strands together and when you emphasize which.
Yeah. So when do things get fixed? Right? When is it always contingency all the time, or are there turning points and moments in which things are fixed? Would that be a fair characterization of what we're saying?
Or do ideas matter?
Yeah. Depends on what the ideas are. And one of the things that I wanted to take seriously is white supremacy as an ideology. As a unifying force that then undergirds republicanism in a specific way. But I mean, this is a flip answer to yours, but it's like a declaration of independence really doing that. So it is. If we think about, let's move away from this stuff. So in 1774, Jefferson writes that abolition of slavery is the great object of desire. That there's so much talk about anti-slavery in 1774. This is kind of that's where everybody's mind is when he says in some review of that this is the great object of desire. And once the revolution starts, the Revolutionary War starts, and there's all this talk about enslaved people, Justin's panel today for my session was talking about how people even in the 1830s are remembering fighting the Ethiopian regiment in Virginia. There's all this kind of talk about the British and working with the enslaved together. That when they go to write as almost all of you I would assume know, when they go to edit Jefferson's draft, Jefferson has 161 words of that talks about that great object of desire and how awful the slave trade is, and he uses all these fantastic words of assemblage of horrors and piratical warfare and all the terrible things that happen the Atlantic slave trade does to men, is what he says. And Congress cuts all that out. They only keep Dunmore's proclamation. So the great object of desire disappears, and Dunmore's proclamation is there. And I think about what would Frederick Douglass have done if had those words been there. Well, I think or Wendell Phillips or some of the abolitionists, like, it matters a lot that those contingencies happen, that they get fixed in a document like that. The Declaration or things like that, which become really, really indelible. Jane Craig's story, that's those kind of things that become really indelible. And when they get sponsored and promoted by political leaders as part of what we really should be.
I'm so sorry. We have reached the close of time on this event. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to invite you all to join us for reception afterward. We continue to start good. We continue to talk about the media, smile afterwards. In the meantime, please do let's give one final round of applause.
Thank you.